Some 15 million people served in the Tsar's Imperial Russian Army in the First World War, and each one had to be outfitted, equipped, and armed. No small feat for any nation, but particularly challenging for Russia, a relatively backward nation beset with resource shortages, poor infrastructure, and a corrupt bureaucracy. But outfitted they were, and today I'm going to look at the uniforms of the Russian army. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War special episode about Russian Army uniforms in the First World War. No military, even to this day, has adopted one single uniform for all of its personnel. Russia, 100 years ago, had distinctive dress for each branch of service, but also a wide variety within each branch depending on things like rank, place of origin, or job description. In fact, there was a dizzying array of uniforms in just the Army. The infantry had more than 1,000 distinct regimental units. And while their uniforms weren't all strikingly different, they were all different. Some units also had height and hair color requirements. The cavalry also had loads of different units, like the Don Cossacks, who had 400 squadrons. And yes, their uniforms, though similar to one another, were distinct. There was also the field artillery, horse artillery, heavy artillery, howitzer divisions, mountain batteries, the pigeon station, courier corps, telegraph companies, sappers, engineers, motor corps, machine gunners, pontoon battalions, railway battalions, disciplinary battalions, and that's not the whole list. They each had distinct uniforms. But in general, the frontovik, or frontline Russian soldier, wore a simple uniform adopted in 1905 during the reform programs begun after Russia's defeat in war with Japan. On their heads, the men wore a furashka, a peaked cap with a visor made of khaki-colored wool, linen, or cotton. These were sometimes stiffened with wire or cardboard. The visor was painted green or black. The caps showed the black and orange imperial rosette and maybe a unit badge. Officers' versions were better quality, were often lined with silk or leather, and had a chin strap. In winter, the men wore the papaka, a tall gray or brown fleece cap with flaps of wool that could fold down over the ears and neck. When it got really cold, these were wrapped in the cone-shaped bashlik cap, model 1881. Helmets were issued in limited numbers. The French 1915 Adrian helmet was issued to elite troops and officers in 1916. It was khaki brown and stamped with the Romanov double eagle. Rarer was the Russian model 1917 Zollberg helmet, not produced in large quantities. There were several types of blouse produced. The 1912 version of the gimnastorka was the most common. The officers wore tailored versions, and the enlisted men's version was far from standard. The color was generally greenish khaki, but because of several factors, including the origin of the dye, there were many different shades. Some were greenish brown, others even white. These had shoulder boards, which varied in color from unit to unit, and with different markings according to rank. The blouses were belted and worn over khaki pants of cotton or wool. These were loose at the hips and thighs and tight at the knees, and tucked into what was most likely a Russian infantryman's most prized possession after his rifle, if he had one, his high-top black leather boots called sapogi. The tough, knee-length 1908 model boots were seamed at the back of the calf, had an iron horseshoe heel, and hobnailed soles. They were so desirable that even German soldiers were known to replace their own boots with the Russian ones if they could get their hands on a pair. Later in the war, though, when there was a shortage of leather and everything else, they were replaced by ankle boots and puttees. The Russians did not wear socks. They wrapped strips of cloth around their feet, which was cheaper and, from what I can find out, more comfortable if done properly. As to the Russian field gear, it was worn on, over, or attached to the gimnastorka. In winter, it went over the greatcoat, or shinel, a large, heavy brown or grayish overcoat that you've probably seen in a million movies and photos. They could be both single and double-breasted, and could have buttons or hooks to close them. Officers wore a similar version, not as roughly cut, that was lined with fleece or fur, and had a big chest flap that could be buttoned up. The buttons were of different designs and different materials. The belts worn over these blouses and greatcoats were leather, either black or brown, and had a rectangular brass buckle stamped with a double eagle or some other emblem. On either side of the buckle was a brown leather ammunition pouch, the 1893 model, each one holding 30 rounds. The men carried a variety of other gear in addition to ammunition. Canteens were made of aluminum, copper, glass, or wood, and were slung over the left shoulder and secured at the hip. On the right hip was a shovel that doubled as a frying pan, perhaps also an axe, and one of several types of wire cutters. Men carried a bread bag, a mess kit, and a gas mask. Gas masks were of several types, actually, but probably the most effective was the Zielinski model, which used charcoal filtering that was originally designed for purifying vodka. The bashlik, that cone-shaped winter headgear, was carried crisscrossed over the chest with the ends tucked into the belt. Some men also carried ammunition bandoliers or rolled-up bedding. Now, you rarely saw a bayonet scabbard, though, since the model 1891 bayonet was to be always attached to the rifle. Again, these were the general uniform details. There were well over 1,000 variations, as I said before, so you get a bewildering variety of uniforms in just the Army, let alone the Air Service, the Navy, and the administrative units behind the lines. Russian soldiers endured conditions that were at least as bad as those on the Western Front, if not far worse. Scorching hot summers, brutally cold winters, mountain peaks, filthy trenches, swamps, deserts, you name it. The men of the Russian Imperial Army fought everywhere and died by the millions, and were indeed a mighty force with which to be reckoned. Today was a brief look at what they wore. We'll include some source materials in the comments if you want to look up more. We'd like to thank Lauren W. Mitchell for the research for this episode. If you want to learn more about British uniforms from World War I, you can check out our special about that right here. There are some great books on World War I military equipment, and you can buy these in our Amazon store where we get a percentage of the checkout price. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.